If you thought that medical marijuana was about being a pothead, then you definitely need to listen to today's episode. We're talking with Dr. Rachna Patel, the medical marijuana expert. She'll be sharing with us marijuana's history as a medicine, the politics behind why it fell out of favor, how she works with people to find the right dose of the right strain to treat patients, and much more. There'll be no getting high today on the Nutrition Heretic podcast. So I'm sure you've heard that as you age, it gets harder to lose weight. Well, that's total bull because my friends Laura and Veronica Chows, they can prove it. They're a mother-daughter duo, and they've lost 125 pounds between the two of them at ages 50 and 20. And they've kept it off for over 2 years without starvation, deprivation, or hunger. So now you can learn their system and a whole lot more with a free 10-day trial to their online membership. They'll give you the diet, the recipes, classes, and more. Sign up today at nutritionheretic.com/utmost-diet.
Fat is bad for you.
I just pop a pill and I'm fine.
Meat is murder.
It's time for bad food punishment. It's time for real nourishment. It's time for the Nutrition Heretic.
The following program is provided as information only and may not be construed as medical or health advice. It is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any disease. No action or inaction should be taken solely on the basis of the information provided here. Please consult with a licensed healthcare professional or doctor on any matter relating to your health and well-being. Aloha and welcome to the Nutrition Heretic podcast. This is Adrienne Hugh, the Nutrition Heretic. This week I want to, as always, I talk about something that is very personal to me, or something that happened to me. And this was actually something that happened with my mom. Because as you folks know, my mom, when she was sick, she ended up in a rehab center in Florida and she was not eating. And what was put on the table was medical marijuana, which was a big jump for us because even though my family's from Jamaica and people think that Jamaicans do nothing but sit back and smoke pot, my family was never into marijuana, and it was, probably stemming from an Anglican religious view of such things. But this is what they ended up putting my mom on, and lo and behold, she did start eating again, and it also helped that I was feeding her stuff she actually wanted to eat because she didn't want to eat the stuff that they had there. But it was amazing, the transformation in her health for that brief time. Of course, the whole doctor that put her on the marijuana as soon as I left took her off of it, so she stopped eating again. And that was really a shame because he essentially killed her, through that act, which really, to this day, there were so many things wrong with this doctor, let's just say. But in any case, that is why today I have invited Dr. Rachna Patel to talk with us. She is the medical marijuana doctor. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, Dr. Patel, I talked about how, in my family, marijuana was not a thing that anybody expected to do. It was just wrong, right? Mm-hmm. How did marijuana get such a bad rap?
So a couple different things. We sort of have to put it into historical context. So let's start with the 1930s. Okay, so back in 1937, a man named Harry Anslinger instituted a tax on marijuana. So whether you wanted to sell it, use it, grow it, prescribe it, you had to pay a tax on it. Now, specifically, if you wanted to prescribe it, the doctors had to report to the federal government all the details about who they prescribed to, why they prescribed it, where they lived, all of that. Now, the reasoning behind this tax was a couple different things. We're talking about the 1930s here. So this is during the Great Depression in America. Now, what was also going on was that there was a great migration of Mexicans into the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the jobs that they took on was working as campesinos, working
Right.
in the fields.
Right.
And so there was sort of resentment on the side of the Americans because they were without jobs, and here were these Mexicans that had just come into this country who did have jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, culturally, the Mexicans used marijuana, okay, recreationally and medicinally. So that's where the whole concept of loco weed came about. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
that was one part of it. Now, the other part of it was, I don't know if you've heard of William Hearst.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So he was a big publisher, and then he eventually also started to own paper making mills as well. So hemp, which can be a source for paper, was a giant threat to him. Okay,
Mm.
so just like you have corporate America lobbying today, the same thing happened back then as well.
I was going to
Right?
say, boy, how times have changed.
Right. Exactly. And then you had the DuPont family. Now, the DuPont family around that time had patented, I believe it was synthetic nylon.
Okay. I thought they
So
just did
again,
weapons.
what was that?
I thought they just did weapons, the DuPonts.
I think they did a lot of things,
Yeah.
but they patented synthetic nylon. And again, hemp as a source of cloth was a threat to their industry as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of sort of motives politically and economically going on. And Harry Anslinger himself, admittedly was a racist. So he had no problem instituting this tax. So now fast forward to the Nixon era. Okay, this is the time when the Controlled Substances Act was passed, right? And this is when, and then you had, the whole Drug Enforcement Agency that was formed, et cetera. And this is when marijuana was classified as a class 1 substance, right? So same category as heroin, same category as LSD. And then you fast forward now to the Reagan era, okay? And this is when we had the war on drugs,
Exactly.
right? And this is when the whole sort of myth that marijuana is a gateway drug was perpetuated. And so that's sort of the whole history, starting 1937. Now, interestingly enough, before 1937, marijuana was available over the counter at pharmacies. So it was available for purchase, and it was used for all sorts of things like menstrual cramps, arthritic pain, opioid withdrawal. So already had a lot of different medical uses prior to 1937 in the United States and worldwide.
Wow. And wasn't the Declaration of Independence written on hemp paper? Was there something about that?
Yeah, I haven't looked it up, but I think it was.
Yeah. And I believe that a lot of rope and things like that were also made out of hemp once upon a time when, they were on ships, for example. But yeah, textiles, I guess, a lot of it's not like it's so new. And seems like it's had many practical uses aside from what you talk about as far as the medicinal uses, but the hemp plant had a lot of practical uses. So explain for us the differences between hemp and what we call marijuana.
Yeah, so it's a legal distinction. Okay, and basic legal distinction. This is an internationally accepted legal distinction, which is that hemp by law has less than 0.3% THC, and marijuana by default has more than 0.3% THC. So
Gotcha.
that's the distinction between the two. And that's really what that's a piece of information most people need to carry away with them when it comes to the difference between hemp and marijuana.
Okay. And then, we'll go into, actually, I'll go into THC later because I want to talk about that. But, so what was your epiphany because you went to standard medical school, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, I did.
Just to be like a straight up family physician, or did you have a particular area that you were eyeing up at the time?
In emergency medicine.
Okay.
So I was in training in emergency medicine at the time.
Okay. And then how did medical marijuana put itself on the table?
Yeah. So I saw an ad on Craigslist. And basically, in residency, I turned into an insomniac. I was working probably 80 to 100 hours a week.
Yeah.
And at some point, what ends up happening is that you get so wired, you have a hard time, no matter how tired you are, falling asleep, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, just like any other insomniac, you're too tired to actually get real work done.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
you spend a lot of time surfing the internet
Right.
or watching TV or eating food that's bad for you.
Yeah.
And so I was surfing the internet. I was on Craigslist, and I saw an ad that said medical marijuana doctor needed. Now, at the time, this really piqued my curiosity because here's what was going on. I, as any other hopeful medical student, entered into medical school with the hopes of saving lives. But really, what I saw happening was that, on the one hand, so let me backtrack a little bit. What do you do in the emergency room as an ER doctor? You rule out the most emergent cause.
Mm-hmm.
And then if there isn't an emergent cause to the patient's complaint, then you send them home with, if it's pain, you send them home with prescription pain medications and instructions to follow up with their primary care doctor. Okay.
Right.
So on the one hand, I was handing out prescriptions for these pain medications, but on the other hand, I saw patients that were suffering through side effects from these very medications. I saw patients that would come into the emergency room for their fix because they had become addicted to these medications.
And we now know there's an opioid epidemic.
Yep. And another result of the opioid epidemic was that I was in the unfortunate position of having to resuscitate patients that had overdosed on these medications, right? That was probably the most common emergency that we would see in the emergency room. So here I was, as a doctor, really, truly our job is to solve problems. And really what I was doing was that I was creating problems rather than solving them. So that's why the medical marijuana piqued my curiosity. So I started to dig into the research. And about a year later, what I found most compelling was medical marijuana's application for treating chronic pain. Mm-hmm. Okay. So at that point, I figured, okay, if the books can say one thing, the research can say one thing, but how the medicine truly plays out, in real life is sometimes a completely different story. So at that point, I signed up to work at a medical marijuana clinic out in California. And this was back in 2012. And at this point, I've been in the field for over half a decade. We're going on year 6 now. And there's no turning back at this point. I mean, it's medicine that's significantly improving the quality of patients' lives.
I wish you were in the same room because I'd be high-fiving you constantly on like everything that you're saying right now. I mean, from the fact that you were astute enough to observe that people were not getting better and that there was a problem that you had to resuscitate people, like, and how do other doctors not see that through the same lens that you saw that?
I think they do, but here's what happens. Complacency happens.
This is true.
At some point, I've had a lot of colleagues, I graduated med school in 2009, right? So they've been practicing now for, some of them 5 some odd years. And I've talked to them, and a lot of times what happens is that they make a good living. It gets to the point where they're sort of just rolling on by because they know their medicine. It's not as much of a challenge. And I think they become complacent at some point,
Right.
I mean,
I hate to say it, but I would argue that not everybody gets into medicine for the same altruistic reasons that you did.
I agree.
I think there's just way too many people who still look at it as, wow, I can save lives and make a lot of money. And there seems to be a little bit more emphasis on the amount of money they can make than
although, I mean, if you think about it from like a practical standpoint, like if you could do the calculations for hours or dollars for hours,
right?
Like you're not doing your math right.
Exactly.
You're better off doing something else. Unfortunately, there actually aren't too many doctors in the area of medical marijuana. But yeah, that's sort of how I ended up where I am today.
Wow. Well, thank you for seeing past that and, kind of, I guess, entertaining it even, because another thing that you said to me that really struck a chord is that there's research and then there's how it plays out in real life. And what I see, because, promoting the brand or whatever, I go on social media and I see a lot of people talking about, well, what's the research say? What does the research say? So now everything that actually happens to people becomes anecdotal.
Yeah. So here's
But,
the
the people who do the research are usually not in the office seeing what happens, right?
Yeah. Now, here's the important point I want to make. Okay. There is such a thing known as off-label drug use.
Yes.
Okay. So what does this mean? That means that you have a prescription medication that's being prescribed for an indication for which the FDA has not approved it for.
Right.
Happens all the time. Okay. So I don't feel like I'm doing anything different than prescribing a medication for off-label use.
Right.
So I'm basing it on the clinical results that I see. So yes, there's anecdotal information, but I don't really go by the anecdotal information. Right. As a physician, I know what information I need to be looking for. And I go by that. And I also go by the trends that I see in the thousands of patients that I've treated, right?
Right.
So that's what I'm going off of. There is research. Research is, however, preliminary, right? And a lot of it is in mice and in rats. But again, as a physician, I can take that information and use it to apply it to to how I practice. So that's essentially how I see it.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think sometimes, though, too many physicians and lay people think that the research is the truth versus your clinical experience. So, what happens clinically does not always get the respect that it should, right?
Yeah, and actually, what's interesting is that a lot of times medications will be approved by the FDA for a specific use, and then once it goes to market, they find that it's killing people, or people are having suicidal or homicidal thoughts, and then they have to take it off market.
Yeah.
So that's another important thing to know as well.
Right. And we talked a little bit before starting the interview, and I was telling you I lived in New Jersey, which we know was the pharma belt. And I actually ended up working in pharma for a few years, and it was pretty distressing to see some of the stuff that would go on, and like you're talking about, this off-label usage. In some cases it seemed like the condition warranted using something, like the risk outweighed the benefit outweighed the risk.
Yeah.
But that sometimes it was like, really? You really think that's a good idea? So
that's really interesting that you brought that up. But I was shadowing a doctor out in Dallas, the Dallas, Texas area way back when. And he was telling me that for the longest time, the drug reps that would come to him were middle-aged white men. Mm-hmm. And then he noticed a shift. The drug reps started they started to send in were former Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders.
Yes.
And it's interesting because they'd send male drug reps to female doctors and female drug reps to male doctors, anything that sort of persuaded the doctor. And what was interesting was that when I was in med school, the Sunshine Act, it's funny that they call it the Sunshine Act, was passed. And that basically said, before this act was passed, doctors were being treated to, lavish vacations, cruises. So they were sort of like under the they were gifts. There was no actual contract that, hey, I'm going to give you this and you have to prescribe my medication. But again, it's playing with human psychology, because when you receive a gift from somebody, you feel indebted to reciprocate that favor. So that's really interesting that you bring all this up. And what's interesting is that I see medical marijuana as a giant threat to big pharma.
Oh, for sure.
Because it's like killing multiple birds with one stone, right?
Yeah.
So the most common conditions that I treat are chronic pain, anxiety, and insomnia, right? And there are a lot who in America doesn't have one of those three or a combination of those three, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the medications that are prescribed for these conditions are some of the more commonly prescribed medications in all the United States.
Exactly. I
So,
represented two of them when when I was working, and the only way I got through, I could like look myself in the mirror, was to tell the doctors all of the side effects, like because nobody would ever go over the side effects and the contraindications.
yeah,
And many of them had been prescribing these arthritis, migraine pain meds for years, and they had no idea. And they're like, "Oh, I just had somebody in my office today, and they never told me that." I'm like, "Yeah,
yeah.
because I'm like the only person at the entire powwow that we just had who wasn't a cheerleader. Like literally every woman on my team was a cheerleader, a former
Yeah.
cheerleader."
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. It's an industry that's very interesting if you look sort of at the inner workings of it. And there's actually a great movie that Anne Hathaway was in. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I don't think
Um,
so.
let me look it up here. But it was that gave a good insight as well.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Oh, it was Love and Other Drugs.
Oh, I heard
Uh,
of it, but never saw it.
yeah, they focused on Viagra when it was like first coming out, and how the drug reps were competing to get the greatest number of sales and whatnot.
Right. Yeah, I
Um,
remember that.
yeah, but I don't mean to take the conversation off
No,
topic.
no, no, no. But I mean, it's just, I think it all works together because we're talking about, this still somewhat a controversial substance, and why is it kind of marginalized? What made? I mean, it's definitely making a comeback now, and not just by potheads. But it's
Yeah.
people are starting to realize there's actually something to this. So in light of that, what what does marijuana do for us? And what I'm talking about is the cannabinoid system. Can you talk a little bit to that? Is that the only thing that we're seeing? And what is the cannabinoid system? And then how does marijuana affect it? And are there other ways to access that system?
Yeah, so all sorts of ways. So basically, what is the endocannabinoid system? It's one of the systems that we have in our bodies that it's basically a system of homeostasis. It helps to keep a lot of things in balance, including things like appetite, things like sleep, things like even protecting you, for instance. Okay, the system serves a very important role. Now, the system was only discovered really in the early, 1990s. So that's its fundamental role. Now, the way that it helps, like pain, for instance, a couple different ways. One is that it helps to reduce inflammation. Okay,
Mhm.
so and it does this by working on the autoimmune system. So specifically what it does is that it causes the death of cells that cause an autoimmune reaction. Okay,
Mm.
so that's one, and it's very targeted. Number two is that it suppresses the production of cytokines, and cytokines are they're sort of chemicals involved in starting and stopping inflammation. So if you suppress these chemicals, you're starting less inflammation in the body. And the third way is that it activates what are called T regulatory cells. And T regulatory cells we have and this is where the protection part comes in. T regulatory cells we have in our bodies to basically prevent an autoimmune attack. Okay, it keeps things in check. And so what marijuana does is that it activates these T regulatory cells. Okay, so that's one way that it helps with pain. Another way that it helps with pain is that it dampens the sensors that pick up the pain signals.
Mhm.
Okay, so we have receptors all over our body and their main job is to detect pain. And what they've found in animal models is that whenever somebody's in pain, they create even more receptors, cannabinoid receptors. Okay, and the more receptors that you have surrounding the pain receptors, the more the signaling that gets sent to the brain is dampened.
Mm.
Okay. Now the other thing is that it also is involved in the emotional processing of pain. So there's two components to pain. There's a physical component, what hurts, and there's the emotional component. How does it feel when it hurts, right? So when something hurts, your brain is telling you this does not feel good. And really, it's in place so that you do something about it. But what happens is that with medical marijuana, again, it's sort of that signaling that goes on between the physical processing of pain and the emotional processing of pain gets dampened. So a lot of times clinically, I have patients telling me that, hey, when I use the marijuana, the pain is still there, but it doesn't bother me as much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Or the medical marijuana helps to get my mind off of the pain so that I can focus on other things.
Right.
So that's one of the ways. I mean, when it comes to like anxiety, for instance, marijuana is what's called a serotonergic, right? Mm-hmm. So it works along in the serotonin pathway. And that's how it helps with anxiety, for instance. And I can probably go on and on with all sorts of different medical conditions, but those are the more common ways that it works.
Right. And one of the things that I'm hearing is that, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but through this kind of dampening effect that you talk about, and kind of coping mechanism that it seems to engage, is it possible that to say that it makes you more accepting? You know what I mean? Like in a sense that like more passive with pain and things like that, where you don't fight things that normally your body gets riled up about. Is that?
Give me an example.
Just I'm just trying to think. You said something specifically, and I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. But in terms of like, I have pain here, but I'm not engaged with the pain. Like it's not exciting, kind of like a negative response out of me. Yeah. So I accept that there's pain there, but it's not the end of the world now, where maybe it was beforehand.
Yeah, and that has to do with the emotional processing of it, right?
Right.
Your emotional reaction to it is dampened.
Wow. Yeah. And now does that, once that, let's call it high, wears off, does it kind of stay there, or does it increase slightly? What happens afterwards? Because I think one of the things that worries people is getting addicted. Like I don't want to be a pothead my entire life, right? I don't want to get addicted because if but then they have no problem with opioids somehow. But when it comes to this, people seem to have their antennae up a little bit more, right?
Yeah. So I wouldn't even call it a high. I mean, what patients are experiencing is not a high.
Okay.
A high comes from using excess amounts of marijuana,
Gotcha.
right? And that has that euphoric effect. It can range from a euphoric effect to anxiety, to paranoia, to hallucinations, to numbness and tingling, to nausea and vomiting. That I would consider the person having taken a toxic dose of marijuana.
Right, gotcha.
What I'm focused on is my patients taking a therapeutic dose of medical marijuana. Okay, so that's where you're taking a dose that's just right, where it's not too little, where it's not having an effect, but it's not so much that you're having side effects from it.
Gotcha.
And so a lot of like, to address your concern about addiction, I always like to use the analogy of alcohol. So, you have a person that drinks a glass of wine on a nightly basis. And then you have a person that comes home and drinks a pack of beer, a case of beer on a nightly basis. The person who drinks the pack of beer, the case of beer, is more likely to get addicted to the alcohol than the person who's drinking a glass of wine. A lot of it comes down to how you're using that substance, right? So same with opioids as well. If you're overdoing it, there's a greater likelihood of addiction. Same with tobacco. I mean, with tobacco, over time, people tend to use it more and more and more. But if you smoke once every 6 months, it's not like, you're automatically an addict.
Right.
And not that I'm advocating for smoking
I hear you.
tobacco.
Yeah, no, you're just putting it into context, it's.
Yeah. So that's how I put it into context. And one of the main sort of fundamental purposes that I serve in my consultations is that I'm walking patients through how to safely use it so that they can avoid the side effects altogether, avoid any sort of tolerance, right? And they're not taking it maximally; they're taking it optimally, so that they're not overdoing it.
Right. So then how do you work with people to determine what is, I'm assuming that the therapeutic dose may vary from person to person. But, to get to that optimal dose, is that pretty much trial and error?
There is a component of trial and error to it, but I narrow it down by a lot for patients, right? So I'm walking them through for their particular set of conditions, for their particular set of symptoms, which combination of cannabinoids are going to work best for their condition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the cannabinoids are the chemicals that marijuana makes. Then I'm walking them through which method of administration, which delivery method is going to work best for their particular condition. I'm walking them through a method of figuring out how much to take.
Gotcha.
And then I'm walking them through figuring out how often to use it. So it's a very stepwise methodical process that I'm walking them through. So it narrows it down for them.
Gotcha.
And it increases the likelihood of success that they can have with the medical marijuana.
Right. So tell me, I'm going to back up a little bit. With the endocannabinoid system, we talked about the cannabinoids in marijuana being able to access that system. Are there other foods or other things that people can engage in that are not marijuana that may
stimulate the endocannabinoid system?
Yeah.
None that I've come across in my research.
Okay.
There probably are, there probably are things that do make cannabinoids, but a lot of it also comes down to you have to surpass a certain threshold to start to feel the effects of it. So nothing that I've encountered that surpasses that threshold.
Gotcha. And so literally the cannabinoids in cannabis are what, as far as we know now.
And we naturally make our own endocannabinoids,
gotcha.
Right? So that's why we react to the chemicals in the marijuana plant, because you can think of these are called phytocannabinoids, the chemicals made in the marijuana plant, and you can think of them as the chemicals that we make, the endocannabinoids. You can think of them as their twin.
Right.
And so that's why they're reacting to the chemicals in the plant.
Right. Is this a little bit like the phytoestrogens in, say, soy? Working?
Yeah, similar,
okay.
right?
Okay, similar concept.
Structure. And so the body recognizes it as the same.
And so, okay, sorry, I don't mean to harp on this too much, but do we know what the precursors of our endocannabinoids are?
Yeah, they start off as fatty acids.
Okay, so they are fats. Okay, that's what that's what in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, could butter, somehow be involved or whatever, fatty acids be involved. Okay, gotcha. That's really fascinating to know. So then when it comes to, you talked about walking people through the process of determining what's the ideal dose for them and dosage mechanism. What's the difference in what happens between smoking, edibles, tinctures? And I don't know, are there other ways? I guess topically.
Yeah, there's all sorts of other ways. There's topicals. There's also even, you mentioned quite a few of them, but there's also vaginal and rectal formulations of medical marijuana as well. And then sublingual. So these are drops that you use under the tongue.
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant when I was saying tinctures.
Okay.
I was thinking of sublinguals.
I didn't realize that you mentioned tinctures, but differences in all of them. There's a difference in how long they take to take effect, and also how long the peak concentration lasts in your system.
Okay.
Those are, I would say, the fundamental differences amongst all of them. But also, beyond that, the patient's history has a very important role in selecting a method of administration. So let me give you an example. Like, for instance, my patients who've had gastric bypasses, okay? In these patients, a lot of times they have a hard time absorbing anything that they ingest, anything that has marijuana in it as in the form of an edible. So, sometimes they have to use an alternative route of administration. So, you have to take really the patient's full history into account in order to figure out, okay, which method of administration is the best for this particular person.
Okay. So I've got to ask, because you put two other ways of dosing this. on the table.
Yeah.
Why would you stick it up your butt? You know, like what's going on there? Is it
Yeah. So,
relaxing the sphincter,
um,
or is it more for an absorption
so
to
it's
other
more for
parts?
absorption. Like typically in medicine in general, when all the other routes of administration are not possible, that's when you use the rectal route of
Hmm.
administration, right? So for instance, a child that comes into the emergency room seizing, right?
Hmm.
They can't take anything oral.
Gotcha.
IV, sometimes it's hard to get a line in them. Okay.
Hmm.
So in that case, what you do is you use a rectal formulation.
Gotcha.
Vaginal is something new, and I would say the most common use of that has been in my patients that are postmenopausal. They've reported that it helps with sensitivity
Ah,
during intercourse. So that's the most common use of that. And that's probably the least tested, I would say, the least researched. I think, I wonder if someone just decided to come up with it. And then
somebody was
started to
bored.
yeah. So, because I haven't encountered anything in terms of research on that particular method of use, but it has proven effective in that patient population.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was trying to figure out. I was like, well, it could go either way, you know. Like, either it's direct for the area, or it's like you said, the absorption is better, or in the case of a child who's seizing, might help to get it into them so that they can stop. I mean, I really want to know the range of disorders, because I'm hearing like it almost seems like the miracle that everybody has been looking
Yeah.
for when some
So,
people talk about
yeah,
it. Yeah.
and I always caution people that it's a great medication for a lot of conditions compared to pharmaceuticals, but it's not your miracle cure, right?
Right.
So, like I said, so actually, you know what would be a great topic to talk about in relation to this is who should not use medical marijuana.
Good point.
Because there are definitely people out there that should be incredibly cautious about using medical marijuana.
Hmm.
So you have people with heart conditions, okay,
Mm.
any underlying heart condition, especially if it's an unstable heart condition. Why is that? Because excess amounts of marijuana can increase your heart rate, and that can then exacerbate the underlying heart condition.
Right. Yeah. And you talked to that before when you said some people vomit and, have basically negative
Yep.
response.
Yep. And that's like any other medication, right? You
Yeah.
take too much of it, you're going to get the side effects from it. Then you have patients with psychiatric conditions, especially those who've experienced visual or auditory hallucinations, what we typically call psychotic episodes.
Mm.
Okay. Again, anybody who takes excess amounts of marijuana and they've had a history of psychotic episodes, they're more prone to these psychotic episodes.
Right.
Okay. So that's another group. Women that are planning to become pregnant, that are pregnant, or that are breastfeeding. So I err on the side of caution in this group because the jury's sort of out when it comes to the research. Some research says that there are no harmful effects on a growing fetus or growing baby, and then there's some research that does show that using marijuana while pregnant can lead to low birth weight and preterm labor and or delivery as well. So I personally, the way I practice is that I err on the side of caution in this population and recommend that they not use. In children, dosing is extremely important, okay, because
Mm.
they're having cases of accidental
Oh,
overdoses
jeez.
in Colorado. And they do come into the emergency room in what's described as a comatose state.
Oh,
Okay.
God.
And then you have people who with lung conditions, right?
Hmm.
So obviously they shouldn't be inhaling marijuana, period, because it can exacerbate the underlying lung condition.
Right.
So in this sense, I think a lot of marijuana is being touted as a miracle cure, especially like for instance with cancer. Okay, this is
Hmm.
something I feel very strongly about. The claims that marijuana cures cancer. As a physician, but even as a physician who's treated patients who have had cancer. I would not make the claim that it cures cancer, right? So again, that we're getting into the realm of the stories that people find on the internet.
Right.
How much of it is true, how much of it is not true, things like that. So, and the conditions that it works great for, like I mentioned, are chronic pain, anxiety, insomnia. Now, with the cancer patients specifically, it works great if they're undergoing chemo and they're experiencing poor appetite, significant weight loss, nausea, vomiting. Works great for that. And we don't really have too many medications on the market that sort of solve that problem for patients, okay, as well as the medical marijuana does. There is Megace. Megace is an appetite stimulant, but it increases the likelihood of blood clots. And there's already a greater likelihood of blood clots in patients who have cancer, right? So you're putting them at risk of something that could potentially kill them. Then I also, let's see, what else have I treated? This falls under the category of pain, but patients with menstrual cramps, for instance, okay, perimenopausal or postmenopausal women that are experiencing anxiety, insomnia, or even hot flashes, it's helped with as well. So helps with a lot of conditions, but it just, it's just going to depend on what set of conditions the person has.
Right, right. So when people talk about medical marijuana, how different is that from just marijuana? You know what I'm saying? Like the plant, for example.
Yeah.
Is it compressed into a pill or do because I hear people talking about, well, this is better to take edibles, and then they throw a bunch of recipes up, that put it in this.
Yeah. Okay. So it really depends on what state you live in. Okay.
Okay.
So there's really three categories of states: states that have legalized for recreational use, states that have legalized for medical use, and states that have not legalized for either. In the states, so let's start with the states that have legalized for recreational use. In these states, typically it's mandated by law that the products are laboratory tested. Okay. What is the advantage of a laboratory tested product? You know exactly what's in it. You know what's in it in terms of the amounts of the different cannabinoids. Okay, that's important because then you can predict what sort of effect it's going to have on your body. Not only that, but they're testing for things like pesticides and fungicides. For in an unregulated market, if someone's using lots and lots of pesticides, that can add up. And then when you're using it, that can build up in your body. And a lot of these pesticides are what are called neurotoxic. They can cause damage to the brain. Okay.
Right.
They're also testing for things like fungus and bacteria. Now, people who have compromised immune systems, right? So we're talking about patients who are undergoing chemotherapy, patients who've had organ transplants, patients with HIV, AIDS. They are more prone to getting infected with this fungus and bacteria that may be in the product or the plant.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the advantage in a recreational state. Okay. And you'll see the irony in all of this. Now, in medical states, it's not always required by the state for the products to be lab tested. I would say in most states it is, but in a lot of states it's not necessarily. And then you have the states where it's neither legal for medical or recreational use, and I'm assuming most people are getting it off the streets, and you don't know what you're getting. And especially in this situation where you're getting it off the streets, you run the risk of getting marijuana that's laced with other drugs. Okay, so it could be soaked in ketamine. It can have PCP on it. So that's really the difference between medical and off the streets, is that you're getting a regulated product where you know what's actually in the product. And also, we realize that it's an industry in its infancy. A lot of this sort of just skyrocketed once Colorado legalized for recreational use.
Right.
That was back in 2012. So it's only been 6 years. We've made a lot of progress in 6 years. But it's an evolving industry.
Right.
Okay. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, just my little follow-up is that, so what you're saying is that medically, like the medical marijuana is not changed really from the original form in the sense that it's not just, let's say, the cannabinoids that are pulled out.
No.
Right? It's actually...
Yeah. They're still making pot brownies just like they were back in the day, except now it's from plant material that's tested,
Gotcha.
right? And grown in highly regulated conditions.
Right.
And not only that, but you may find pot brownies that are gluten-free, vegan,
I
and
was just about to
sugar-free.
go. I was just about to go there. I was like, okay, but now you got the person who refuses to
Yeah.
to eat it because it's got the gluten or it's got an egg or something
Yeah.
else.
And it's packaged, it's manufactured, made at a manufacturing facility as opposed to, someone's home and someone's kitchen.
So
It,
specifically how much each brownie, let's say,
yeah.
is
Yeah.
worth. Like,
Yeah. And when it comes to THC in states like Colorado, they don't allow per serving size more than 10 milligrams of THC.
okay.
So that's the difference in getting access to products in recreational states.
Wow. Okay. So then, okay, now we talked about THC. Recently, I told you before we started, I just bought a home and I have goats, and I was going in my backyard and I slipped on a rock and wrenched my knee. And so after going to the acupuncturist and the chiropractor, I was given a little backup pot, no, not pot, what's the word I'm looking for?
CBD.
Container of, just a little container of CBD
Yeah.
ointment. What's the difference between THC and CBD? And when you're dosing medical marijuana, is that consideration part of what you're looking at? In other words, do you pretty much just have one that you prefer over the other for what you deal with, or is it a combination, or depends on the person?
Depends on the combination of symptoms and conditions that the patient has. So some patients benefit from high amounts of CBD. Some patients actually benefit from high amounts of THC. And then there's some patients that need both. Okay. So, and you'll find patients that automatically assume that it's a CBD that has all the medical value in marijuana. And a lot of times they'll buy something off the internet and then they'll come to me and they'll be like, Dr. Patel, I kept on taking more and more of this and it did nothing for me.
Right. And there's a big MLM someone was trying to sell me on a couple of weeks ago, and she's just oh my gosh, this is the best stuff.
Yeah. So it's going to vary. Now, I have a great video that your listeners will find very informative. It's on how to buy CBD oil, okay, and really what to watch out for, because there's a lot of random websites off the internet that are selling CBD oil products, okay. And interestingly enough, the FDA ran some random tests on some of them. Some of them had basically the claim that they made on the label, what was actually in the product in terms of CBD paled in comparison to what was on the label.
Wow.
Okay? And so this is why I have patients telling me, hey, this didn't work. Secondly, there were products that had more than the 0.3% THC. So that's why I have patients coming in telling me, Dr. Patel, this says high CBD, but I felt high off of it. So you want to be very judicious in figuring out, which product to purchase. And that video will walk you through the questions to ask in terms of, when you're trying to judge a company and trying to purchase from a company. So I think they'll find that helpful.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, because this stuff that I was given is, it had so much eucalyptus camphor in it that I was like, I might as well just be using Tiger Balm, because that I don't know that it did anything beyond what just straight up Tiger Balm, camphor eucalyptus combination would have done for me.
Yeah. One of the questions that I always tell in that video that I tell people to ask is, make sure the product is laboratory tested, because even those products, you can send them to independent labs to get tested.
Right.
And ask for those results so that you know what's in it, right? It could have nothing. Maybe it just has camphor in it for all you know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was hoping, since it came through the medical, through my acupuncturist, that it would, have something more to it. But I was like, for $50, I could have just stuck with $3 Tiger Balm as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, so laboratory testing is the best way to go. Is to really delve into the results, and the more independent laboratories that they can get test results from, that product that company can present, the better. So back to your question about the differences between CBD and THC. There are a lot of differences between the two, but the most fundamental difference between the two is that THC is psychoactive. That's what causes a high, and CBD is not psychoactive, doesn't cause any sort of high.
Okay. But it does still relax you, and
Again,
or at least depending on the
yeah,
person.
yeah, and the psychoactive effects typically kick in only if you take excess amounts of it. Up
Gotcha.
until a certain point, you'll just feel the medical effects of the THC. Okay. So that's, I would say, the fundamental difference. But really, I have no preference. What really matters to me is that it's giving my patients results,
Mhm.
and that's, like I said, it's going to vary from patient to patient.
Right, right. And is it correct to say that depending on the variety of marijuana, that it would have either more THC, just varying degrees of THC
Yeah.
versus CBD?
So yeah, and that varies on a couple different things, right? So it varies on the amount of the CBD and THC that it will produce, varies on the plant genetics and the environment in which it was grown. Okay, so
Hmm.
it's just like humans. How do humans turn out? It depends on our genetics and the environment in which we were raised.
Right.
So same thing with the plant. They produce different amounts of chemicals based on that.
Right, right. Wow. So, what are, I guess, the biggest challenges that you experience right now in your profession as a medical marijuana endorsing doctor?
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's been an evolution. When I first started in the field, my greatest hesitancy was losing the respect of other physicians. Okay,
Mhm.
now I am sort of the girl that's never really cared about what other people think, but professionally, this mattered to me because if another physician, what matters the most for a doctor? Your professional opinion. That it
Right.
carries weight, it carries respect. And if another doctor doesn't respect your opinion or disregards your opinion, then it's kind of like game over, you know?
Yeah.
There's no point in practicing. So that was the biggest thing. And I remember this is when I started in 2012. Now, despite feeling that, I pushed forward. And in 2014, I started my own practice, brick and mortar practice. And one of the things that you typically do when you start a practice to establish yourself is that you go around to physicians in complementary fields, right? So,
Mhm.
like for instance, a cancer doctor, an oncologist, I would be able to help them because they probably have patients that are suffering with nausea and vomiting, weight loss, poor appetite, that they aren't able to help, right? So then they can refer to me, and then I can't treat cancer. So the cancer patients that come to me, I then refer them, put them in the hands of a doctor that can actually treat them.
Right.
And I remember I could not get past the office manager. Basically, the door, the door was just slammed in my face.
Mm.
Over time, I started to get referrals from other doctors for patients. They would send their patients to my office. So I closed my brick and mortar just recently, and with one of the goals being to travel the country and to speak at as physicians conferences.
Mhm.
So I just spoke at a conference in Maui here. One of them, I'm going to be speaking at the Maui Medical Society soon. But now it's really incredible how engaged they are as an audience because patients are coming to them with questions and questions that they don't have answers to. And
Right.
I, as a physician with experience, I have those answers, right?
Right.
So it's interesting how in a period of 6 short years, not even six, probably 5 short years, how much it's evolved over time. It's almost like the people have made their voice heard, and now
Right.
the physicians have no choice but to learn about medical marijuana.
That's exactly it. And that's, in many
It's
ways, that's the blessing of the internet.
Yeah, and
That,
it's powerful. It speaks leaps and bounds that of, in this one case where the people's voice was heard.
right.
And I think the big pharma has to listen, the government has to listen, physicians have to listen, and I think they rightfully so made their voice heard because this is a medication that has a potential to make a big difference in the quality of people's lives.
Right. Exactly. And, that's when I worked in pharma, that was the big thing. Like, oh, yeah, well, it's better they take this drug, even though it could give them a heart attack
Yeah,
because, it'll improve the quality of their life. And it's like, well, maybe if we can avoid the heart attack part of the
yeah.
equation, it'd be nice. I'm not an expert, but I'm just thinking out loud. it really makes a lot of sense, especially when you look at it through the historical lens, and that this is not something new. And then also kind of the rationale behind why it became so taboo
Yeah.
for such a long time. And, I've definitely heard things about the civil rights era and how that, had an effect on it as well. Where the government had kind of identified a lot of the Black intelligentsia as smoking pot when they would have their discussions. So, well, we can't get them on freedom of speech, but we can get them on using marijuana.
Well, I
right?
mean, even law enforcement using it as a means of racial profiling, when they're doing like checks, stop checks and whatnot. What's interesting is that the medical use of marijuana dates back to 2700 BC. That's when in China they first documented the use of marijuana medically. But I'm sure it goes back even beyond, earlier than that. Okay. Same with India. The way that marijuana was introduced to the Western world was through a man named his last name was O'Shaughnessy, or I think that's how you pronounce it. But basically, he was in India. He was an Irish physician in India, and he noticed that the Indians would use marijuana medically. And this was in 1850. That then it was introduced to the rest of the world, and up until 1937 in the United States, it was used medically for over a decade, or about a decade. Yeah.
Right. Well, the one thing that comes back to me more and more is that the therapeutic use of something like marijuana, and very similar in my mind to, for example, someone who might drink a little shot of grappa at the end of a meal, where it helps the digestion, right? These like little digestive aids, that it's not really that unusual throughout the animal kingdom, that like every animal has something that brings them that similar relief. So a very obvious one might be the koala bear. Or koala, let's say, eating eucalyptus leaves and, kind of sedating, getting cats with catnip, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
I kind of feel like there's like all over, my goats they actually like catnip and marijuana, I heard, as well. But I don't think it's that unusual. And if we see ourselves as part of the animal kingdom, it's not a far leap to understand where there might be a place for this.
Yeah, what's interesting is that back in California, I had neighbors that grew marijuana, and they also had Arctic wolves as pets.
Oh.
And they used to keep the marijuana in a locked up area. And if my neighbor forgot to lock the gate, these wolves, they would not eat anything green, but they would devour the marijuana.
Wow.
They would just like gobble it right up. So that's really interesting, how they're attracted to that, but then not anything else that's green, So there's yes, you're right. There is something about it.
Right.
So there is something about it, but I just we need more information.
Absolutely. And that, I mean, you're part of the movement, because there's a lot of people on the internet who are enthusiasts, let's call them. Don't necessarily have the credential or the clinical experience that you have, and they're making their little recommendations, and they've got their whatever. And in researching for this interview, I went to a couple other sites, and I saw these people offering to help people with their conditions, but not necessarily knowing where their expertise comes from.
Yeah, and guess who ends up cleaning up their messes?
You. I'm just going to wild guess.
That's happened quite a bit, where it's like, I'll get a call from somebody and they're like, well, this person told me to do this, and this happened. And I was like, oh my goodness. But yeah, I think it's important to, a lot of times you'll hear things like, oh, you just have to use your intuition and it'll guide you on how to use it. I don't think so.
They say that about sugar too, like there's a lot of people say.
Yeah, if you're tuned into the medicine and the science behind this, there's a method to it. There are boundaries to it in terms of dosing. There are side effects that need to be avoided. So all of that, but you need to be aware of the science of it in order to know this.
Right, absolutely. I do have a question for you from one of our audience. Her
Mhm.
name is Lisa, and she wants to know if there's any benefit for dementia.
Dementia. Okay, so I have treated a handful of dementia patients. The one aspect of their condition that it helps is anxiety. Okay, a lot of times that anxiety can lead to aggressive
Yeah.
behaviors, and it's helped to calm down the aggressive behavior as well as the anxiety that goes along with the dementia. That is the only aspect that of it that I've found that it helps with.
Yeah, because when I think of pot, I think of people who forget a lot of things.
Yeah,
So I don't know that it would help with that. But yeah, that's the it's the anxiety that people
yeah,
feel like, oh, I forgot something again. You know what I mean? Like they know
yeah.
something's wrong, but they can't really put their finger on it. And yeah, the anxiety builds up. So that would totally make sense.
Now, does it affect the progression of the disease? Does it stop it or slow it down? No, I haven't found that to be the case.
Okay. And again, this just speaks to the fact that it's not a silver bullet that's going to, across the board, just solve all your problems, which unfortunately I think we fall into a trap as human beings of wanting just one thing that we can go to and everything will be okay. So, on that note, thank you so much, Dr. Patel, for speaking with us today. This has been one of the more fascinating uh, interviews that I've given in a while. Your website is drrachnapatel.com. That's drrachnapatel.com. And she also has a YouTube channel of the same name as well as a Facebook page.
Yeah, and your listeners are more than welcome to post their questions in the comments section of my YouTube channel. I do one of two things. If it's a very commonly asked question, I'll create a video answering the question. And if it's just a simple question that I can answer just generally, then I usually post a response there. And then if it's something where it's specific to their situation, typically I recommend just setting up a consultation with me.
Right.
So that's how I usually go about answering questions.
And you've also got some packages on your website. So you offer protocols that I guess can be downloaded maybe as a PDF or a set of videos. And then you've also got like a more that combined with a more of a one-on-one
Yeah,
consult,
so
right?
people have options in terms of how to work with me. What I've gone ahead and done is that I've created protocols by medical condition, right? So
Mhm.
so all the things that I was talking about in terms of what combination of cannabinoids to use, how much of it to use, what the best method to use for that particular medical condition is. All of that I've video recorded and packaged along with consults. You can pick the number of consults you'd like and made that available. And as the year goes on, I'm going to be creating more and more protocols for various different conditions.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for
It's
giving me the platform to talk about this.
oh, for sure. I'd love to have you on in the future. So please keep in touch.
I will.
On the just before I let you go, is there anything else that was on your mind that you really felt we didn't speak about today that you'd really like to get out there, or a recommendation?
I think we covered it all.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rachna Patel. It's very nice to meet you. Thank you for your work, and we hope to see you again. The Nutrition Heretic Podcast is a production of Savor the Journey, LLC. Our audio editor is Nicola Popovich. Our podcast manager is Crystal McLean, and our operations manager is Michelle Med. I'm your host, Adrian Hugh, the Nutrition Heretic. You can find us at the new and improved nutritionheretic.com, where you can download the Nutrition Heretic's free shit list of 7 health foods to avoid like the plague. You can also listen to previous episodes at nutritionheretic.com/podcast. Be sure to like us on social media for updates. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/nutritionheretic and on Twitter @NutriHeretic. Contact us with show ideas, questions, or if you want to be a guest. And don't forget to rate our podcast on iTunes and Stitcher.